So now I'm going to tweak the particle system even further, and I'm going to pay particular attention first to the particle emitter, which is the part of the system that really is responsible for generating or spawning new particles. I'm going to be controlling the shape and the emission rate. So to do that, I move over here in the Object Inspector and scroll down, and you can see that we have these groups emission and shape. I'll start by tweaking the shape, so I'm going to click on shape, and when I do that, a whole new group expands beneath. And you can see that for the shape of the emitter, by default it is selected to cone, and in the viewport you can see we have a gizmo here which draws out the gizmo, the emitter, which is a cone. You can see the shape represented here. Now I could of course go ahead and completely change this to a different shape. For example, I could move over to shape here, select cone and change it from cone to say box, and there we get a box emitter, which actually looks a bit better right now, but I'm going to be sticking with a cone. So I'm going to select on this shape parameter here and change it back to cone. So first I want to tweak the radius of the cone, the base here, the base radius, to something really that's going to more closely approximate the torch mesh. So I'm going to move over here to the radius and just scroll that down maybe to something like 0.1 perhaps. Yeah, I think 0.1, that sort of more closely approximates this torch here. And again for angle, this represents the angle of this outer radius here for the top of the emitter. So I'm going to bring this in as well. I'm going to reduce this perhaps quite considerably, maybe to something like 0.19, which really creates kind of like a cylinder almost, and that represents the general area where particles are going to be emitted. And that actually is looking better. Right now the generation, the emission rate and things are still not quite right, but I think that this is a pretty good shape for the emitter. Obviously I've actually decided on these values in advance, so I know what I'm going to be using. But in real life scenarios, you'll be sort of using trial and error, going back and forth and tweaking the values until you get something that looks right. So I'm going to switch to the emission group here, and really this is the emission rate, the number of particles that are generated into the system per second. So I'm going to be increasing this. So I'm just scroll this up to something else, to a much higher value. Actually, I'm going to be increasing this all the way up to 37. So let's select 37, and actually that's looking a lot better. We're getting a better fire effect here, but of course this fire is tearing way up here into the distance, and that's not right at all. So again, what I want to do is to tweak the particle lifetime and the particle speed. So I can scroll back up here to these main properties, and for the lifetime I'm going to specify a value of 1.5. And for the speed, I'm going to specify a value of 0.78. And you can see when I specify those values now, we're getting something that's really looking much better. It's actually looking much more like fire. It's still not quite right, but we're going to be fixing that and tweaking it even further in the next video. Now I want to address one of the main problems that has been plaguing this particle system, and that prevents it from looking like real fire. Right now you can see we're generating particles at the bottom of the torch here, and then they just move upwards. But you'll notice that this fire always maintains the same width, and that isn't really how fire behaves in the real world. In the real world we have a kind of tapering effect. So the fire begins at its widest width around about near the bottom somewhere, but by the time the fire reaches the top it kind of tapers inwards in sort of a triangle or pyramid-like shape. So I want to bring that into effect now. I effectively want to change the size of the particle system over its lifetime. So I'm going to scroll down here in the Object Inspector, and you're going to see a group here which says size over lifetime. I'm going to put a check in that box to enable that and click here in this group to expand it. And you can see right here we've got this size field and this kind of linear graph here. Now I'm just going to click inside that graph to bring up the curves editor, which you can see in the preview panel here in the Object Inspector, and this kind of line represents the value or the size of the particle system. So on this horizontal axis from left to right, we have the lifetime of the particle, 0 being when the particle is born and 1 being when the particle dies. And the vertical axis here represents value. So the value of 1 represents the maximum or default size of the particle. And in fact, if I bring down this curve here by clicking and dragging, you can see in the viewport that we begin to get this particle system to thin out. And in fact, if I bring it right down to 0, we can't see it at all because it has no width or size. So I'm going to set the initial sort of size of the particle system to be maybe about there. But of course, as I say, over time we want this sort of width to taper off. So I'm going to select this last control point, this last handle here, just by clicking on it, and just drag it down here to the bottom to 0, like so. So you can see this curve drawing out the general size of the particle system over time, and you can see how that looks in the viewport, which is much better, but it's still not quite right. What I want to happen is to have a kind of curve going inwards here, but what we've got is a sort of S shape. So I'm going to grab this Bezier handle and just sort of pull it upwards here to get this kind of curve going outwards here. And now this is looking much better. You can see in this sort of shape how this tapers inwards, that we've got that reflected in the curve here. And just to prove that this curve really does control the shape of this particle system, we could in fact just drag this Bezier handle way up here to sort of ridiculous values, and you can see the kind of effect that has on the size of the particle system. But I'm just going to bring that back to some sort of sensible range here, to something like that, and that now is already looking much better. It's looking much more like fire, and it's beginning to sort of look believable. So the next thing I want to do is, as the fire rises higher, you can see here, we sort of taper out into transparency. And again, right at the bottom here, you can see sort of the particles being generated, being spawned into the system. And I sort of want to mitigate that effect just a little bit. So again, we can control this by changing the color of the particle system over time. So we have this field here which says color over lifetime. So I'm going to enable that checkbox and expand that group, and we get this color field here. I'm going to just click in there, and we get the gradient editor appear, where we can control the colors of the particle system over lifetime. So the left hand side is the beginning of the particle birth, and again the right hand side is particle death. I can, for example, select this color swatch, which represents the color to be multiplied to the particle system. Right now it's white. And again here, if I click on this one, you can see at 100%, again we've got white. So I'm going to set the starting color, this color here, from white. I'm going to change that to red. So I'm just going to click in that color picker, and maybe just choose red. And when I do that, you can see here in the preview here, the editor, that we've got this red effect sort of being factored into the particle system. So I'm going to leave that there. And again, this is going to taper out to not white, but to a kind of a yellow. So again, I'm going to select that sort of handle there and click in the color field. And I'm going to select a sort of a yellow, maybe something like this. And again, that's looking much better. So I also want to affect the transparency of this system, and we can do that using these top handles here. For example, if I select this handle, you can see the transparency, the alpha value is 255, meaning fully opaque, and the same for the end handle here, which is also 255. I'm just going to change that to completely transparent and set that alpha there to 0, so that we sort of fade out into transparency here. And again, I want to soften the introduction of these particles, so I'm going to set this also to an alpha value of 0. And I'm going to introduce another swatch here, and I'm just going to increase that to 255 to try and mitigate the generation effect that we get going on with the particle system. So I'm kind of happy with these values here. I think that's looking pretty good. I also want to affect the rotation of the particles over their lifetime. So I'm going to click on the rotation over lifetime and enable that. I'm going to set the angular velocity to about 106 to kind of add a sort of swirl to it. And I think that now is looking much better. I might off screen go ahead and just tweak it a little bit, maybe changing the particle system up here just a little bit like that. But I think overall that's looking pretty good. Let's just grab that wall torch and just move it down a little bit into the level and just take a sort of brief look over how this is looking. I think that's looking pretty good. Maybe just bring this just out a little bit further. Grab that particle system, maybe just bring it forwards a little bit like so. Yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. And we've got a nice fire effect going here, and in the next video I'm going to be sort of creating a prefab from this and duplicating it throughout the level. So now we've created the flame torch particle system, and I think it's looking pretty good, so I'm ready to go ahead and create a prefab from this object. By creating a prefab, it means that I can reuse it anywhere else in the level really easily. Plus, I even get to use it in any other levels that I might want to create. So before going ahead and creating the prefab, make sure over here in the hierarchy panel that the particle system has been added as a child object of the wall torch. It's important when creating prefabs that there is one root object and all the rest are children of it. And I'm going to move over here now to the project panel and select the prefabs folder, because I'm going to organize all my prefabs in this folder. I'm going to right click and from the menu choose create and then select prefab. I'm going to name this prefab torch prefab and press enter on the keyboard. And I'm going to drag and drop the torch object, careful here, not the particle system but the torch object, the root object. I'm going to drag and drop that into the prefab here, and straight away it's created a prefab. And this original wall torch object has been added as an instantiation of that prefab. So here in the project panel we have that prefab, and then we have this little right pointing arrow, and I can click that to expand the group, and you can see right here we've got a particle system which is included in the prefab. So now I can just go ahead and add more instances of this prefab to the level. So I can just drag and drop this into the level and just move this up and bring this in here like so. You can see we've got our prefab object. I'm just going to align this here to roughly about the center of the wall. Let's just zoom in and just bring that up here like so. Again, I'm going to duplicate this by pressing Ctrl D on the keyboard. And again, I'm going to just rotate this. Actually, I'm just going to rotate this 180 degrees on the y-axis using the transform component. Let's just bring that here like so against the wall, just penetrating just a little bit, and then just press Ctrl D again. And I'm going to bring the torch over to the other side, around about there. Doesn't have to be exact, we can always come in and tweak it later. And again, if I press play on the toolbar, if I switch back to the scene tab, you can see here all of our particle systems are running very nicely, and that's looking pretty good. Of course, the great thing about having these as prefabs is that if we later decide to make any change, for example, let's say I want to move back here to my prefab, select the particle system, and I want to make a change to the particle system, I can make the change here in the prefab, and those changes will be propagated to all the other particle systems. For example, if I wanted to, for example, change the shape of the emitter, and I wanted to change it from a cone to, say, a sphere, like so, I can now press play on the toolbar, switch to the scene tab, and you'll see all of a sudden the emitters for all of the particle systems have changed. So I'm going to stop that, change that back to a cone, and press play, and you'll see that everything again is back to normal. Of course, if for example I wanted to change just these three particle systems but I didn't want to affect this one, you can do that by breaking the connection to the prefab. So for example, I can select this object here. If I no longer want this connected to this prefab, I can move up here to the menu, choose game object, and then choose break prefab instance, which will break the connection with the prefab. So that's how we can work further with prefabs. We've now reached a stage in development where we can start thinking about post-production. And this refers to all the effects that we can apply directly to our camera and our render that we have here in the viewport. All the effects that we can apply to that camera in order to improve the appearance of our game. We can add things like bloom and vignetting, and these are the kinds of things that I want to talk about here. Now, to add these effects in Unity, you will need to import the Image Effects asset package if you have not imported it already. We imported it at the beginning of this course, but if you don't have it imported, you can import it easily by moving up here to the File menu, choosing Assets, Import Package, and selecting Image Effects. you will see in brackets that it says Pro only, which means that if you're using the free version of Unity, you won't unfortunately be able to follow along with this section. It is for Pro only users. So you can go ahead and import those image effects if you don't have them already. Now the first thing I want to do is we're going to be applying these effects directly to the camera. I've switched over to the Game tab and selected the camera so that we can see a live update of the effects as we apply them here. So the first effect that I want to apply is the bloom effect, and what that does is it effectively intensifies the highlights in the scene and it blurs them both in one operation. Now what this does is it really gives us a kind of dreamy fantasy effect. We often find bloom in fantasy RPGs, and because our game has a kind of fantasy setting, bloom is appropriate here, but it's important not to overdo bloom because it can really distort your renderings. So let's take a look now. I'm going to select the camera object here in the hierarchy panel. I'm going to move up here to the component menu item, choose image effects, and I'm going to be choosing bloom and glow, and you will see here that there are a variety of bloom options. I'm going to be selecting bloom optimize from the menu and select that, and it's added as a component to the camera. You can see the component is called fast bloom, and if I toggle on and off this component, you can see the effect it has directly to our camera in the viewport, and really it's quite a dramatic effect. So what I want to do first of all is change the threshold value. Now the lower this value, the more pixels in this image the effect applies to. So I'm just going to increase it just a little bit just to reduce its effect. And again, the intensity refers to how strong the pixels are affected. So again, we can really apply some quite extreme values there, but I'm just going to reduce that to maybe something like kind of like this, perhaps around about here. And again, the blur size, the amount of blurring to apply, just going to increase that perhaps a little bit and toggle this on and off to see what we've got. I think perhaps that I'm going to just reduce the intensity just a little bit here, like so. Again, toggle on and off, and I think that's looking much better here. It's really a good idea to try to start with subtle effects first, and if you think they're not good enough, then to intensify from there. So we've gone ahead and added a bloom effect here. The next effect that I want to add is vignetting, which adds really a dark blurred border around our image and a kind of blurring around the edge so that it kind of sharpens our focus to the center of the image here where the character is going to be pushing boxes. So to add vignetting, I'm going to choose Component Image Effects, select Camera, and at the bottom here you can see Vignette and Chromatic Aberration. So I'm going to select this here and scroll down in the Object Inspector. Of course, when we added that component, you have to make sure that the camera object is selected. And you can see we have options here for vignetting and chromatic aberration. Now, I can just toggle this on and off, and you don't see much of an effect yet. The chromatic aberration option is not one that I'm going to tweak here. Of course, we could just increase this and really start to dramatically change how our renders look. Chromatic aberration is not appropriate for this kind of game. It could be useful if you're creating some kind of cyberpunk futuristic thing, but that's not the case here. So I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo those settings and focus only on vignetting here. So I'm just going to increase the vignetting value and just show you what it does. You'll see that as I start to increase this, again, we're starting to home in on this sort of visible section in the center, adding a dark border around the edges. So I don't want anything quite like this dramatic effect here, so I'm just going to reduce this maybe to something like that, just to add a kind of subtle darkness around the edges here. And again, I'm going to increase the blurred corners just a little bit, and as I increase the blurred corners, the strength of the blurred corners, you get this new parameter unfold, which is the blurred distance, which refers to the size of the blurring area. I'm going to set it to something like that, and if I toggle it on and off, you can see that actually there's been quite a big difference. In fact, I'm just going to reduce the vignetting effect just a little bit more, toggle on and off, and maybe just reduce that a little bit further, and again toggle on and off, and I think that's probably pretty appropriate here. I might just reduce the blurred distance just a bit more here, And again, just reduce the blur corners just a little bit, toggle on and off. And I think that's about right. That's looking pretty good. There's just this subtle darkening around the edge, and it just sharpens our focus to the center of the image here, which is what we want. So I'm just going to press play on the toolbar, and I think that with our image effects, this is now looking quite good. Yeah, I like how this is looking. The effects really make these sort of colors pop and stand out. That's looking excellent. So let's move on. Now, one common task that you may want to do when testing your games is that you want to test to see how it looks on different resolutions and aspect ratios. And there's a really easy way that you can do that if you come over here to the Game tab. You will see that by default the Game tab here is listed as Free Aspect, which means that if I press spacebar to maximize this view or I minimize it, you can see that the view always expands to fill whatever size the screen might be, so that when I play the game, it will play at this screen size and resolution. And that might be fine in many cases when you're testing the game and you don't really care about the resolution or the aspect ratio. But sometimes you might be targeting a particular device, particularly on mobile platforms, where you need to develop for a specific resolution or a specific aspect ratio. And so you can click on this drop down here to begin to tweak and change these values. For example, if I click on the free aspect here, we get these settings here. For example, if I want to test on a wide screen, a 16:9 aspect ratio, I can select that. Immediately you'll notice that some of the view here is chopped off. We get these grey margins at the edges here, and in fact if I come back out of this view again, we still get these green margins. What this is doing is it's stretching my view here to fit the screen, but it's preserving the 16:9 aspect ratio. So now whenever I play my game, it will always play at the 16:9 aspect ratio. You're not only restricted, of course, to testing specific aspect ratios, you can also test specific resolutions. For example, I can move over here and choose standalone 1024:768, which is not just an aspect ratio, but it's a fixed resolution. So I'm going to select that value here. And again, more of these values here were chopped off at the edges to preserve 1024:768. I can exit this panel. Again here, you'll notice it's still chopped off. And if I press play on the toolbar, we're now playing at this old school resolution of 1024:768. And things are looking good, but it's really just this restricted square resolution. Now, of course, you're not restricted to just 1024:768. You can add your own custom resolutions as well. To do that, you click on this drop down, and at the bottom you click on the plus icon here, and you can specify a fixed resolution. So let's say I want to test at 800:600. This is a really old resolution. It's been around for a long time. So I'm going to choose 800:600, choose OK, and this is now listed as an option in the drop down. So I'm going to select 800:600, maximize this view, and now we're testing at the resolution of 800:600, and things are looking pretty good. So we can test it at any resolution we like. Of course, when I click on this drop down list, if you no longer want this resolution, you can just right click on it and choose delete from the menu, and that goes away. And I can just set this back to, for example, free aspect, and it now fits the screen as it did before. So that's a really quick and easy way at how you can test your game at different resolutions and aspect ratios. It's important to mention, however, that these settings that we apply here for testing at these different resolutions, they don't actually affect the final resolution that your game runs at. These are here only for testing purposes. Now, there'll come a point in development when you're ready to build and deploy to your platform of choice. At that point, you'll want to fill in the product details for your game, such as the company name and the game name, and you'll also want to fix in the final target resolution and aspect ratio that your game should support, and I want to show you quickly how you can do that here. So first of all, you will select File from the menu here and choose Build Settings, or press Ctrl-Shift-B on the keyboard. And when I do that, it displays the Build Settings dialog here. From this dialog, just click the Player Settings button, and in the Object Inspector you can see the main settings for your game. Now, I've typed in the name 3D Motive, and I've also typed in the product name Box Pusher with an exclamation mark at the end. So then what we have here are the main settings for our game. Notice that I'm on this tab here, which is listed as PC, Mac and Linux standalone, and these refer to the build settings for those platforms only. If you're building to something like the iOS or Android or some other platform, then you will have to switch to those particular tabs and tweak those build settings as appropriate. But right here I'm just covering the desktop platforms. So for resolution, there is a tick here in default is full screen, which says that your game will run by default in full screen mode. So you want to disable that if you don't want it to run in full screen mode. And in fact, this might be kind of like a 3D casual game that people might play alongside doing other activities. So you might actually want to disable full screen for this kind of game. There is default is native resolution, and that will means the game will run at the native resolution unless you specify a different resolution. So for example, you could disable this checkbox and provide a particular resolution that is to apply to your game by default. So right here the default is 1024 by 768. If I wanted the game to run at a different resolution, I could of course specify different width and height values. I'm just going to leave default is native resolution here. There's this setting here, run in background. You can disable this. If you disable run in background, what will happen is when you minimize the game, then it will continue to run in the background. Right now by default it's disabled, which means that when you minimize the game, it will pause instead. So it will stop running, it will just freeze, and when you resume or when you maximize the window again, the game will begin running. So we also have this display resolution dialog, which by default is enabled, and typically you may want to disable this for your final builds. If this is enabled, then when your game runs at the very beginning, it will display a Unity branded configuration dialog that will allow the user to choose the resolution to run the game at. You may wish to provide resolution selection in your own in-game options screens, and if you do that, then you want to disable this dialog. So we have that here. We also have supported aspect ratios. If you don't want to fix the resolution of your game and you just want to support a range of aspect ratios, you can toggle which ones that you wish to support here. So these are the basic build options that you have for your game, and I suggest making sure that you fill all these in before creating your final builds. So in creating our game so far, we've come a long way. We've managed to create 2 levels. We've created box pushing functionality, a character that can push boxes that can arrive at their destinations, and we even have a game manager that can detect for a win condition. We've got flaming torches. We've also got the ability to illuminate moving objects in real time using light probes, and we've also got image effects going on, image effects like bloom and vignetting. So we've really achieved quite a lot with our box pushing game, but I still can't help feeling that we can achieve even more. There's still something very important that I think is missing, and that's the ability to save and load our game. Right now, even if I get to the 2nd level, if I exit the game and load it back again, we can't resume back from where we left off. So we're going to want to add some kind of load and save functionality, and that's going to be the focus for the next and the final part of this course. But in this section we've achieved a whole lot, and I hope you found it really useful. My name's Adam Thorne, and this has been 3D Motive. Next up we're going to consider load and saving, so stay tuned.